You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello and welcome to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. And with 2019 kicking us off here, it's a good time to maybe do a little housekeeping and maintenance. So you'll probably notice some new artwork, which includes language that helps describe the mission of this podcast, which is to provide conversations to help educators like you think and better prepare learners for the modern world. Of course, all of this is under the umbrella of TeachThought.com, and the mission of TeachThought is to innovate education through the growth of innovative teachers. And as part of that, we have, of course, TeachThought Professional Development. And because we use the lens of inquiry to design and deliver our professional development, we like to use a mission question instead of a mission statement. And that is, how can we help educators better prepare learners for the modern world? If you've just stumbled upon us and are not familiar with our websites, please go to TeachThought.com or WeGrowTeachers.com for more information. And here at TeachThought Professional Development, we are looking forward to helping educators around the world grow your craft through workshops and upcoming events. And of course, you can keep up to date with those events by subscribing to our email newsletter, checking in on the site and our social media, of course, and listening in here. And please don't forget to leave those helpful reviews and share with your networks. In this podcast episode, I had Telannia Norfar and Chris Fancher, who are math teachers and the co-authors of an upcoming book out in April that is available for pre-order now, called Project-Based Learning in the Math Classroom. And full disclosure, I know both of them from my time with the Buck Institute as a national faculty several years ago, so I definitely recommend the book and know that both of them do high quality work, so definitely worth checking out. We talked about their book, of course, and touched on the topics of project versus problem-based learning and the idea of authenticity. Touched on the idea of moving from small pieces of discrete content to a wider lens to come up with projects and project ideas, and the friction points of pacing calendars, rigid timelines, and accountabilities, and those kinds of tests, as well as ways to design projects that will help you do well on those tests. Touched on the idea in the curriculum of upper-level math and more complex math as it relates to project-based learning and just math in general, and then some other just math and PBL-related strategies and examples before we wrapped up. So I hope you find this podcast interesting and meaningful. Chris was calling in using a phone, so his voice is a little scratchier, and there's, as often is the case with some internet connections, there's some latency issues that you might hear some stops and starts, but I think you'll get the idea, and hopefully it's not too awkward and too distracting. So thanks again, and hope you enjoy the podcast. Well, welcome to the podcast. Today I have Telannia Norfar and Chris Fancher, who, full disclosure, are friends of mine from my time at the Buck Institute, and they are going to talk about their upcoming book, Project-Based Learning in the Math Classroom, and I'm excited to hear more about it because it's certainly a needed and necessary topic and area for exploration. But I think it's probably maybe helpful for our listeners to get a little bit more context about your journey and sort of why and how you got into teaching, because both of you took a fairly non-traditional route. So we'll start with ladies first. Telannia, how did you come to teaching? And then we can go to Chris, and then we'll talk about the meat of the book.
Yeah, so I was, full disclosure, nagged into teaching. I was planning my 10-year high school reunion, and a classmate was just every time we had a planning meeting, kept encouraging me to look into teaching and to come into teaching. And I was like, no, I'll kill somebody's child. That's not a good idea. But after a few times, I went and visited his school. It looked really cool. I always worked with teenagers. I always was helping young and or the youth, and I had a passion for the youth. I was like, okay, maybe I could like wrap this into my goals of owning my own magazine one day. And I chose math as the topic because I just was so frustrated with people being comfortable saying they were bad at it. So long story short, I love it, fell in love with it from the very first week, and can't even imagine doing anything else now but teaching.
So before we get to Chris, what is there one thing that sort of stood out to you? Because I remember my first experience in a classroom, and I've told the story maybe a time or two on the podcast, but there was an elementary classroom where I substitute taught, and I knew I didn't want to be a teacher, but I substitute taught while I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. My mom's a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, but I substitute taught, and I was terrified. But then I just loved that experience. And first grade, and certainly I didn't teach elementary. But was there one thing that just sort of stood out to you?
I would say it was the series of things, but the sort of completely sealed the deal moment was my first project. The school I taught at was a project-based learning school, and I didn't know what that meant. And it was so all I knew was I kind of did projects in my real world, and so I was trying it out. And there was a girl in my class who really wasn't being successful up until that point. I mean, it was an honors geometry class, but she was like my struggling student of all the ones. And in the project, she just transformed. She became the best student in the class. I was like, oh my God, this could really like change people's lives the way I wanted to do in my magazine. I was like, I'm really achieving what I wanted.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Anything else?
Good. Okay, Chris?
Yeah, I started, I was in the Navy and married, and my wife active duty as well. And we had gotten to the point in our careers where one of us needed to get out and shift to the reserves. And she looked at me and said, well, you know what you want to do if you get out. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, you always wanted to be a math teacher and a baseball coach. And I laughed and I said, when did I ever say that? And the next thing I know, I was getting my master's in education and about to go into teaching and teaching math. But interesting thing, when I went through Old Dominion University, and when you went through the master's program there, everything was cooperative groups. Everything was cooperative groups. Everything you taught. And so when I went into my first classroom, I did everything in cooperative groups. And none of my fellow teachers were doing anything like that. And, being as a military spouse, traveled a lot. And when I ended up here in Texas at a school, I continued doing that, and people would come by and see what I was doing in my math classroom, my Algebra 2 classroom, or whatever I was teaching at the time. And word of that got out enough and they were opening up a new tech school down the road, and I got the call from the principal who said, you need to come see our school. And I thought, well, you're pretty arrogant for saying that. And he said, but if you come here, you're going to want to teach here. You really are. And I'm like, who is this guy? And full disclosure, his name's Steve Zipkis, who some people will know. But anyway, I went to visit the school, and at a typical new tech school, he just shook my hand, said hi, and turned me over to students who walked me around, and I saw PBL in action. And I said, all right, this is for me, and this is what I'm going to do. And that's what I did. I taught math and engineering at Maine or New Tech. And then the district asked me to be an instructional coach for a middle school they were bringing in to be a focus in PBL. And BIE kind of happened at the same time. But it's funny because I didn't know there was another way to teach. I thought cooperative and collaborative grouping was just what you did. And I didn't even know there was a name called PBL kind of thing, because I did everything with projects. So similar to Telannia, that's what we did. So why would you do anything any other way?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, and I think that context is important, because I I find, especially perhaps with math teachers, that the math teachers who come at teaching with prior experience outside of the classroom are perhaps more likely, or certainly have an easier entry into doing project-based learning, because I think the anecdotally you have some experience sort of thinking, because your brain already thought as a mathematician probably, and maybe to explain it the other way, so many math teachers I think are trained as math teachers, and they don't have that context and that experience. So it's really hard, I find, for more traditional math teachers to ideate and to really find authentic uses for the math that they're supposed to teach. Does that resonate with you all?
Absolutely. Well, T, why don't you take it first there?
Yeah, so much. And like Chris was saying, I mean, we really didn't know anything else. And so it just was a second nature to us. And we found a way to relate to people who that's not their second nature, to think this way. But yeah, I tell people all the time, I was like, solving for X all day really isn't what people do.
Sure.
In the real world. So I start there to kind of help bridge that gap.
Yeah. So let's. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to add that I think that, because we're leading into the book anyway, that's one of the things I think was my frustration when I first started working with adults and talking about project-based learning in the math classroom, is that I don't see math as a separate thing. Math is used in everything. So what's so hard about coming up with ideas? But again, I come from a different background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's start with one of my usual starting points. Let's talk about the why. So I think it's somewhat apparent why you might write this book. I mean, there certainly is a need for more helpful texts and books and resources for doing PBL and math, but is there a greater purpose, or was there a sparking event that said we really should provide something like this?
Okay, I'm gonna let Chris pick this one up because I'm laughing.
Yeah. Well, here's the truth that I started writing this book because I said, all right, I'm gonna write a book. And I was at a BIE summit with the two of us, and we were talking, and one of our friends, and I can't remember exactly who put it, but looked at both of us and said, you two need to get together and write this book. And we looked at each other like, all right, we'll do it, not knowing what that would entail.
I wonder if that was me.
It may have been.
Probably not.
It was almost 4 years ago now, and
yeah.
But I had already started something, and then T, you were kind of thinking about one too at the same time, and next thing you know, we're being told we have to do it, and we have to do it together.
Yeah, it was completely, and it was so funny because we both were doing it because we were tired of being asked questions. And so we were like, let's write a book. And we both complement each other well with our strengths and weaknesses. So I was like, yeah, we could help each other get this done. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. So let's sort of explore one of the things that I find a difficult piece with math teachers, which is the authenticity piece. So lots of times I see math teachers, and you mentioned the New Tech model, Chris, as far as I'm aware, they lean pretty heavily on more problem-based learning with math, for which to me the difference is the lack of authentic audience. So it's more simulation, perhaps more like an advanced word problem kind of thing. And for me, when I talk with teachers, I think the authenticity piece is a really powerful tool because it gives you the option or the opportunity, what we call leverage, the PBL lever, to really get students to engage in that rich inquiry process of asking, who's our audience, what are their needs, what do they need, and how do I figure out how to meet those needs, as opposed to the grade, what's the teacher need, that sort of game of school. So Chris, let's start with you, and T, add anything that you might. Is how do you define project-based learning, and especially in relation to more problem-based learning and that sort of problem, as it were?
What you said was beautiful. Let me just start with that. The authentic piece is the key, and building empathy. And I do a lot with design thinking now. I teach design now, as a matter of fact, in an IB school. And it's building that, not just the students saying, why are we doing this, but who are we doing this for, and what is their, and that is the hardest thing. And you're not gonna sugarcoat that at all. And so when I define project-based in my head, it is heavily influenced by the New Tech model, because I want students doing more than just working word problems in a end of a chapter kind of thing. I want them to view a problem that they have to solve. And so I want teachers focusing on that with the knowledge that they need to be looking for real, authentic things that are happening around them. And that's not easy, and it doesn't always happen. But don't stop giving them collaborative, inquiry-based work to do. An example, a New Tech math problem that I did. Common geometry problem, transverse lines or parallel lines with a transversal, done in every geometry class you ever do. Who does that? And so there just happened to be a hurricane that had come through Texas, and it destroyed a bunch of sugarcane fields. Sugarcane fields in South Texas, I didn't know until I read this article, had a bunch of canals, and the canals were all built, parallel to each other with little lines going across them to connect the canals. Well, what do you know? You got parallel lines, you got transversals, and what if you had damaged canals and you had to get boats from point A to point B, and you had to use a mapping system of these canals? I mean, there's that real life kind of thing. Even though they weren't solving a problem for anyone, the problem was already being worked on. But at the same time, they had to think like an engineer and think like a boat manufacturer. If you had to change sizes of boats or whatever, there's a lot of authentic things you can put in it. Even though I couldn't at that point give them an authentic problem to solve, and I'll let T kind of take over from there.
Yeah, dang, you did so well. I would just say, and I love this about Chris and I, in that our backgrounds are different and complementary. With him having his experiences and journey with project-based learning, and then me coming with really no training until I went to one institute by Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy. They actually do have a problem-based unit, which I didn't see any difference in the project-based by their definition. They just had more of a no entry event. It's just a document letter, and their product was always a presentation. But the authenticity, everything was there. And I utilized BIE, Buck Institute for Education's model a lot for my own understanding. And what I discovered, as Chris was mentioning, there's so many things around there, but the thing that math teachers need to grasp is that not all of the discrete things we teach are lending to a project-based aspect. And that's where we get tripped up. Like, we want to make a project out of solving for X, for example, a really simple 2x plus 3 equals 5 equation kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But that's not where life lives. It's not that simplistic. And so you have to get bigger and stop thinking of the discrete pieces of math when it comes to looking at project-based learning. And that's where really the love of math, as I've gotten to even know more mathematicians, practicing mathematicians, one of the things I discovered is we're so not like them. They're very much project-based. They're very much in the weeds of don't know and just wondering and trying to figure out big problems. And they're not thinking about solving for X all day either.
Mm-hmm. Well,
matching.
So is then when you're talking about moving away from the discrete pieces, or not moving away from that, I don't think that's the right characterization. So you're talking about widening the lens, and then in that widening of the lens, you might find a project idea that would include solving for X, perhaps, that would be more authentic and organic.
You got it.
Yeah.
Hey,
yeah.
I finally got something.
If I could jump in, one of the things that every teacher who's gone through a PBL training with me has heard me tell this story, and it is a true story. But when I was first in a new tech school where I was told I had to go project to project, there was no gaps. There were just constant projects. I suddenly started seeing projects everywhere, or potential, again, using the new tech term of projects, but I saw these around me everywhere, and I was sitting at a restaurant with my wife, waiting for our meal to come, and I picked up the salt shaker, and I looked at the holes on the salt shaker, and suddenly I was going, are these this size hole because of the size of the salt crystal, or is it the flow rate, and there's math. I mean, that's math right there.
Yeah, and it begs the question then, and I'm sure you both have heard this pushback. I have heard this pushback because one of the friction points that I see in doing great projects in any content are prescriptive and rigid curriculum guidelines and pacing and things like that. So how do math teachers sort of manage that? Because widening the lens to get a project that encapsulates larger amounts of content might, but doesn't necessarily, and in lots of math teachers' minds often doesn't, fit with their pacing guide and calendars, because it might include solving for X, but it's not in the right month or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kick off on this one because that's a big one I get a lot, and you're absolutely right. So I take it as a step-by-step thing. I was like, one, realize with anything, you can start small with what you try. So don't feel like you're gonna have to throw everything you're doing out to now do project-based. You could do elements of it to start, or you can do one. You can look at all of your curriculum pieces and find one spot where things are put together well that you can make a project out of, and then grow from there. And then the other conversation I have with them is, I also ask them, because sometimes people are like, I'm really, 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 tied to this. And then I'm like, really? How? Who's coming to see you? Because, we get that way as teachers, but the reality of it is I've seen my principal maybe twice so far, and that was in the hallways. They're not in my classroom. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I'm not really even looked at until a state test, which so many places you don't even have that as the accountability measure. And so they sometimes are also giving themselves this pressure that really isn't there. Mm-hmm. And so then I ask myself, okay, now let's also think about this. Let's say you're just doing what you're doing and you get to week 2, but your kids don't get it. Do you not stop? Do you just keep going on? And many of them be like, oh, no, I'll stop. Okay. I said, so you're not really following the prescription either.
Right.
So give yourself a breather on some of this stuff, because there is things that you're not following. But start small. If you really are trying to not do this so unsuccessful, or if you're really scared to start small, but also realize you're skimping in other areas too.
And one thing I was going to add, because that was perfect, because start small is the key, and give yourself permission to go small. I tell teachers, and the problem there though is quite often when we do these trainings, the expectation from the principal or the district maybe is we're going to do these 6-week projects, and everybody in the school is going to do 6-week projects. Well, the math teachers panic. That in 6 weeks they look at their PACE guide and they're like, I can't do a project for 6 weeks. Don't do a project for 6 weeks. But you need to make sure that I talk to the principal or whoever's there as an administrator, say, hey, give these guys a break. They do have this pacing guide, and they are freaking out, and we need to give them permission to start small so that they and their students are successful. That's the other key, is we want the teachers to be successful and the students to want to do it again.
Yeah, and so there's a few things there, sort of tentacles I'd like to explore, but one of the things that when we talk about doing project-based learning, a big concern or a question, and rightfully so, and we can debate the merits of accountability tests and all of that, but it is a reality. And T, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that teachers and administrators need to have some frank conversation about what that, like, really, how accountable am I to my principal, and should I be scared of my principal, that kind of dynamic. And once that gets cleared up, it's liberating, and I think there's a misperception there, but there is, in lots of cases, that state accountability test. So when I talk with folks, I come back to that and say, look, let's start small, because you want to get good at this, and there's a learning curve. It's a trajectory. You're certainly starting with a 6-week project and doing it poorly is likely to result in poor scores, but when we look at doing project-based learning really well, and one of the sort of markers or quality indicators, if we want to use test scores and that kind of metric, what are the strategies that we need to be including in the projects that really will help get to that sort of test scores and accountability? And Chris, we'll start with you.
I think one of the things that's going to help with test scores and the ability to do projects is making sure you have some sort of inquiry in the classroom all the time. And we're talking, just starting with, the 5-minute warm-ups, but not have the 5-minute warm-ups be 5 problems where, I'll use T's, where you're solving 2x plus 3 equals 5. Something where they have to think. It could be estimation today. It could be statistics thing another day. It could be doing geometry the next day, but they have to think about what's the right answer, what are possible other answers, or there are other ways to do it. So they're already thinking in that way, so that when they face, and my whole experience with standards-based is just, or not standards-based, but standardized testing is the state of Texas. So I know the state of Texas tests and what they look like, and I help students with SATs and ACTs and things like that as well. But the word problems and things they get on these tests are fairly easy if you have the stamina. And I talk to students about building stamina in that, there's 50 whatever problems. You need to be able to mentally look at these problems and, go through that inquiry process. What do I know? What do I need to know? And how do we solve this? And that, if you can get that on a daily basis, I think you're settling the point where students will be successful down the road. And I think just, adding problem-based or project-based to that just, makes it even better.
T, anything to add there?
You said that so beautifully. I would just add, one of the things that came to my mind is an experience I had in high school with my AP calculus teacher. And I remember going into that test thinking I was going to bomb it, because I was not, she used different colors, but my paper was bloody every time that I ever took a test in our class. And I remember even telling, I was like, I really think I should drop this class because I'm not going to pass. And she was like, I'm telling you, you will. I was like, I'm pretty sure this paper shows that I'm not. But we actually, all of my classmates, we were all feeling that way. We went into the test. We walked out telling each other, was this really easy, or was it just us? It was like, that really felt too easy. And it turned out most of us had a 3 or better. I ended up having a 4. And what I realize now as a teacher is she went way beyond the test. Mm-hmm. Her class structure was way above the target, and we couldn't help but reach it because she was going way beyond that. And so I remind teachers of that, as the beauty of project-based learning is you really are charting a bigger course than just the standardized test. And so in addition to all of the test questions you could have that's like the test, I mean, there's a lot of just test prep things that you could do, even just 2 or 3 days before they take the test, regardless of project-based learning. But you have the opportunity to really think of what all you want students to reach beyond that test, and they meet it. Like, I haven't ever had below, and I usually have a high SPED, ELL, repeat population. I mean, I usually have the children that don't pass the test, and I've never had below a 70% pass rate.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned AP Calculus, which leads me into another question that often arises and really even is being debated by some folks at I think higher levels, not as much as perhaps it should be, but and this is maybe not PBL related. I'm just curious. I don't want to get into the weeds too much on this, but I'm curious of how you all think about the current sort of curriculum of math. I think AP Calculus kinds of classes are definitely harder, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe you can push back on that, and I'm happy to hear that. But to find authentic people doing AP Calculus and find authentic examples and projects, I think can be more of a challenge there. But it begs the question, and I think it's an important question just in math teaching in general, where should our focus be? I've heard lots of folks say statistics should really be a big piece of math curriculum because we use it and it's an integral part of our daily lives, whereas AP Calculus certainly isn't. Even solving for X is, as far as I know, not. And so, what does that look like, and how do you all think about what math, if you could sort of redesign the math curriculum, would it be different in what ways?
Ooh, okay, I'll kick us off. I think one, as Chris mentioned, Texas is different, but I think it's still similar. Same with Virginia. But I think the Common Core state standards did bring in a much more, it's not the end all, it's still needing to be tweaked again. But I think it expanded the look of math and definitely brought in more statistics than had been before. Pretty much math, you're right, was always all roads lead to calculus. And you pretty much were not like looking at all of the aspects of math that has grown over the last generation. Even just the mathematical development in computer technology could be added to the curriculum better too. And you're right, it's not like I'm teaching AP Calculus now, and I'm like looking at it, I'm like, nope, they would not, like, no, we're not, yeah, they need to know this much about more physics. And so it just starts to be really hard to do a project in that class. But I think you could, as a math group, I think you as I know I have with my colleagues, start to expand what you want kids to know and be able to do that the standards may not always just have. I know we as a PLC have talked more about the kids' emphasis on them being able to communicate mathematically, them being able to problem solve in general. And so we're coming up with just interesting problems for them to grasp, regardless of whether it fits our content or not. So I think teachers can do that without it being a mandate or a push, but I think we have made some strides. And we're still, NCTM, who I'm a big member in, is even doing more to expand that to mathematical thinking rather than content specific.
Yeah, the mathematical thinking and reasoning is really, really the key here. And one of the things, I was teaching at an international school in the Netherlands, and one of my fellow math teachers was from Canada, and she used the Ontario math system or something like that it was called, but it was out of Ontario. And what I liked about that was they did not have algebra and geometry, for one, broken up. They had a math level 1, math level 2, math level 3 kind of thing, which encompassed algebra 1 through pre-calculus over a 3-year period. And it gave you opportunities for enriching kind of questions because you're mixing the geometries and the algebras together. And I think that I really think we need to do more of that, where we're not segregating the algebras from the geometries, because one of the things, we have a new geometry teacher who was one of my students, I might add, at our school. And she and I sat down with her curriculum, and she was saying that, that the math lead really wants her to have more algebra in it. I said, you've got algebra in every one of these problems. They don't have to have, you can have unknown lengths and unknown volumes and all this other, wherever you want to put an unknown, and you've got algebra in your geometry, and you can do it from day one. And I think it's that, looking for places to have learning and enriched learning going on in your classroom is just going to help all the way through, and then when you get to calculus, I think when I went through, there wasn't an AP calculus. I took calculus in high school because I was ready for calculus in high school, and there were maybe 10 of us or whatever who took it. But there wasn't the pressure or the money that's involved with AP. So yeah, no, we could talk forever on that one. But I think the pressure now of having X number of AP classes on your resume before you apply to college has just gotten silly with that. And I think that's, again, that's another podcast.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too deep on this, but I think the point that some of those upper level math courses are serving as gateways that are keeping some kids from graduating and or being successful or getting into colleges because it really hurts their grades, but they have to take this. And we see this in schools sometimes differently, as some schools are more geared towards higher education, and others are lower socioeconomics, and perhaps the sort of hurdles and that kind of thing are different. But the question about the marginal utility of AP calculus or physics versus really how important is that? And I guess that's a question. I mean, in your mind as mathematicians, and T, I know the Buck Institute has a new video with you in it, which is fantastic. It's finance and embedding math, and I've used that in some of the workshops that we do, and chuckle and laugh because you have a different hairstyle in every single. But that's not, at least as far as I can tell, it's certainly not AP calculus or physics. And so what is the value? Because I know there is value, but how valuable is AP calculus and physics and that upper level math, and how do we find that balance in our curriculum versus mandated courses and that kind of thing?
I think the thing we've lost, and I'm hoping we're getting back, even the AP test has changed to a better format. I think it's more about the persistence of problem solving. So like I tell my AP calculus kids all the time, I was like, the calc that I'm about to teach you will be done in 2 seconds. The rest is problem solving. Like there really isn't much to calculus as the way we weed kids from it. Like it's really just one step. It's a rule. But then the later part is the problem solving process and thinking through how I want to approach it, which also gets my kids. I was like, now we could end up getting to the answer too in a lot of different ways. It just depends on how my brain likes it. And so I think that's what we got to get better at. And the video you mentioned, which I remember even as I was videotaping, I was like, people are going to be really tripped out of the way I was like, but this is what I look like. You're going to see me in all these different forms, so might as well do it in the video. But it was a pre-calculus class, and there was a really extensive study of exponential and logarithmic equations, which is a part of your finances, whether you're really aware of it or not. Mm-hmm. It's either happening to you or you're taking control of it. So that was one of the reasons why I liked doing that project, is to show kids that some aspects of advanced math really does happen. And thankfully, computers do a lot of the hard, heavy lifting for us now. But if you can get this basic principle of, things could really grow for you or things could grow for someone else. Exponential is growing for you and logarithmic is growing for somebody else. Then you can really navigate your life better. And I think we'll get there. And podcasts like this helps us bring that to life.
Chris, any thoughts there?
Yeah, my only thought that I'm going to add is the resiliency with the students. And my own kids, my daughter, who's now 26, she went through, and I told her, your senior year, you have to take calculus. Well, and she was a BC kind of a student in math. She was not, straight A's. And she said, why do I have to take calculus? I said, you have to take calculus because when you're 40 and you've lost your job and you want to go get another degree and they want you to have bad calculus, you will have seen it. She goes, well, can I drop it mid-year? And I said, if you make it to December and you really hate it, you can drop it. And in about November 15th, she said, can I drop it? And I said, yes. But you have gone through that. So she has gone through that. My son did the same thing, except he went all the way through it. But anyway, an interesting thing, she just got a job 3 weeks ago with a tech firm, and they are heavy in the construction world, and they put them through a 1 week kind of engineering 101 kind of thing so that they would understand all the terminology and everything else going on. And there wasn't a lot of math, but at the same time, she could understand everything that they were talking about. And I said, see, that half your calculus helped, didn't it? but resiliency. They need problem solving and resiliency. That's it.
Yeah. Well, the sort of mathematical thinking and really just the thinking and one of several of the blog pieces and work that we do. I mean, TeachThought is not teach content, it's TeachThought because it's really about thinking. And Chris, you mentioned it earlier, and I've said it multiple times over the years, is that this idea that we have students that leave as masters of the content in our courses is sort of laughable. I mean, it's somewhat of a nice ideal, but I mean, most teachers aren't 100% masters of every piece of content, and nor is it their job necessarily to have 100% mastery of every piece of content. It is certainly important to know your content well enough to be fluent, but a better ideal, I think, is to get them to be able to think like mathematicians or scientists or whatever content area that they're working in, which means that they need to have some content understanding and that kind of thing to be fluent in it. So that resonates with me. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of designing PBL and how do you suggest, I know this is a part of the book, what are some of your suggestions and sort of processes for math teachers in particular to come up with project ideas and ideate, because that's a big sticking point.
This is the fun part for you. I'm going to let you start.
Okay. I do love this. And the one thing the training I went through a few years ago was looking at power standards. Power standards being those standards that you're going to see throughout. I think something like rational expressions. Rational expressions sounds like a big boys game, but you learn those as fractions in third grade or whatever. That is a content that is going to be seen over and over and over again. So if you can feed some sort of rational expression, manipulating fractions somehow in every grade, from second grade, first grade, whatever, all the way up through calculus, your students are going to be successful. So where do I do that? And that's where I like to go. Like who worries about rational expressions? Who thinks about rational expressions? And you don't have, like, as we said, in this podcast, and we say in our book, start small. So think of some simple way you can find a relationship. Maybe you're looking at trying to fit a certain number of kids into a play group or something like that, and you have a certain room that you want to fit them in. Anyway, somewhere where you can have a ratio of X to Y, and how can we problem solve that using rational expressions? I mean, that's just, I just threw that out there. But that's the way my mind works. So when I'm working with math teachers, I'm like, okay, give me a content that is something that that 2 years from now they'll also need to know this skill and come to that skill. What is the skill that we need to do? Let's do something with that, if possible, in your class. And I just throw that out.
Okay,
Yeah,
T?
that was, and it was one of the things that I think was probably the most challenging for me and Chris as a part of the book is how to make this really visible to teachers. And literally in the book, which comes out in April, which now we're seeing so many people wish it was coming out yesterday. But we looked at, okay, how can we make this into steps? Because math teachers like steps. And how can we say the step, but then also sort of tie it to something practical? And so in the book, we that's literally the first step is thinking of your standards or thinking of an idea. And then we explain how it happened in a project that we give a full example of. And then the next step is thinking of the duration, because so many times teachers are like, this could take forever. No, you can make it last 2 weeks. Or you can make it last a week and a half. Like, you can determine the time span and do it based upon what normally is the length of teaching that. And then you think about what students, and I think this is the hardest part for math teachers because we're not used to creating anything in math other than the answer to a problem. But thinking about what does that standard look like in real life, what would be evidence of learning. And so we even give some examples of, like with mathematicians, they're working Vita when they're solving a problem. It looks just much more sophisticated. Proposal, design plans, those are all common real world math projects. And then tying that inquiry to the creation of that product. And then finally, coming up with what the question or the problem could be that brings everything together.
Yeah, and so let's move into sort of that next step. And I'm curious, you mentioned the sort of steps, and I think that can be helpful. We have published, there's a piece that we have, so 8 basic steps of project-based learning to get you started. And it's really meant as a framework or a guide, just a rough guide. I know that Chris and T and myself, we have done enough projects and worked with enough teachers to know that it is not as simple as doing steps, but there's a real value, I think, in giving some basic steps. And as teachers are getting started to say, okay, so this makes sense to me, I can follow some steps, and then the teachers who have really high processor speeds and are really turned on, and I find that the inquiry piece is just such a spark that they recognize, okay, so this is just a sort of recipe to get me started, and I don't like that term recipe, maybe I'll edit that out, but the idea that, all right, this gives me a starting point. Now I kind of have my feet in it, and I remember, I don't know if you all remember, back in the 90s when the original Buck Institute pieces, they had John Larmer. I thought they were really well designed and just really thoughtful in ways that I'd not seen instruction designed, and they were not authentic projects. They were more simulations, so maybe more problem-based. But for me, seeing that and saying, okay, I see what you did here, I can sort of take that and then improvise and do something different, but I see what you've done there. So when you talk about those sort of teaching strategies, what are some of those pieces, and how do you move maybe from the basic baby steps to something that's a bit more craftsman-like?
You hit on a key word you may not want to edit out, and that is this recipe idea. When I was first trying to do project-based learning, I kept feeling like I was giving them a recipe. First you're going to do this, and then you're going to do that, and then you're going to do this. And it wasn't until my new tech mentor, Kevin Gant, who is just an incredible PBL brain anyway, he said, and he gave me a couple of key things of just kind of leaving out steps and having them, figure out what is that next step. And it instantly changed everything. And I went from giving the students a recipe to giving them a challenge that they had to use inquiry and kind of talk together and collaborate and come up with ideas of how best to solve this issue.
Yeah, and I was about to say, I mean, I'm actually about to cook a shrimp and crab boil for the first time tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm using a recipe from a friend of mine who's really good at it. Because I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I know how to cook, but I've never cooked this before. So I don't think,
Right.
and and that was one of the other things we made sure that we were putting in the book. We gave several examples, and then many others will be online, of tasks or PBLs. And we realize that sometimes teachers can just jump into a PBL. And we call tasks basically very short inquiry pieces. They don't have all of the elements of PBL, but it's a great place for some math teachers to start. And so, you could follow ours almost to like the letter if you're feeling that uncomfortable.
Right.
And you're not so savvy. Like, I mean, yes, I'm going to follow my friend's recipe, but I'll probably ad-lib a couple of things just from what I'm used to with cooking. But I'm still looking at what her ingredients are. And I'm still looking at going to buy those things that she said and trying to do the order she said, because I've never done this before. So we tried to make sure we're giving that insight to people, as well as allowing for you to use your teaching background of what you know to implement as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, I know you have some examples in the book. Are there one or two that you might care to share, just sort of the basics of, to give a bit of a teaser? I know April seems like a long ways away, but it's on pre-order, and we'll give all the links and that kind of thing.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, one of my favorite ones is actually non-content based. It's called The Ultimate Classroom. And the reason why I like it is because it can really get teachers off to a good start. It's one that you should do at the beginning of the school year or the beginning of a semester if you happen to be trying this mid-year. And it could be any math content that you're naturally teaching. So I think that helps teachers not think about it. It doesn't have a huge audience. It's pretty much just people helping kids think about how they learn and how they process, and how you can make the classroom into much more of a student-centered spot. And I just like the way it's a great foundational project for anybody to do.
Okay, Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say the one that always sticks in my head is when I was just in that one chapter we talk, where do you come up with ideas? And I talk about, going to the back of, to the gifted and talented section, because, of course, the gifted and talented kids are the only ones who ever have, good problems. No one else is allowed to use good problems. But anyway, so you go to that section. I found this word problem about this girl getting a rabbit, and Dad wanted to create a rabbit run and had to figure out how much, it was basically around surface area and how much screen and they were going to need for this rabbit run. And I turned that into a problem that's about a 2-week problem that the teachers will be able to work with.
Nice. Okay. And one last question here before I get you to share links and things. Is there one sort of dynamic or concept with teaching PBL that either of you or both of you think is maybe the spark that starts the fire, and really once teachers sort of have this aha moment, they go off and you can't stop them from learning more and experiencing and experimenting with PBL? Is there one thing?
Getting back to when I was told to pull away from the recipe, that first project I did, that very first project was right after the Christmas break of my first year doing PBL, and I gave the intro to the unit, and the students turned around and started discussing the problem in their groups, and I just kind of looked around the room, and it was that feeling of like, oh my gosh, the kids are running away with this learning. And, I'm not up here lecturing. They are discussing these things and are, off and running. And that feeling is, you can't beat that feeling when you see students engaged with the learning.
Yeah, I ditto that. And I would say to add, that's such a hard one. But one that I still to this day get giddy about is when my students are interacting with their real audience.
Yeah.
I remember I was, oh God, I always say I'm so glad that social media was not as big when I first started teaching. It would have been a bad experience. But one of my first projects, I'll never forget, it was presentation day, and I definitely was doing a lot of things wrong. But the students were waiting for their turn, and a couple of groups pulled me aside, and they were like, can we go in the hallway and keep practicing before we present? I really want to do well in front of them. And I was like, absolutely, I'll call you in. And that happens every time. I mean, even though we practice, I gotten better about how to help them practice, they still want to get it right. And they still just are intrigued, even when it's just sort of the end process and they're just meeting people and growing together. They just are completely different than they are with me. I feel like they don't even love me no more. They just love these people that came in.
I find, I'll answer my own question here, because one of the things that I find, especially from a teacher perspective, is when they sort of recognize the power. And Chris, I know I've seen some things on Twitter, social media, or somewhere where you've kind of alluded to this as well, that power between leverage and dynamic of the relationship between the driving question and what you might call a need to know list. I'm sort of becoming fond of need to learn list, because when we shift, to me, that experience, that shift from push teaching of here's what you need to know, sit down and I'm going to teach it to you, then I'm probably going to test you, and then we may move on. You might remember it, you may not, that more traditional setting, to that pull dynamic where I'm going to pose a question, a challenge, a scenario from which I'm going to get you, hopefully, to pull and facilitate those questions that are connected to the content and more, that when teachers see that and experience that, it's just like, oh, wow, I can get them to voice these things, and then it's a real powerful dynamic, as opposed to sort of writing the learning targets up on the board, or I can statements of years ago there was a meme that went around. It's sort of like, hey guys, we're going to watch a movie, but I'm going to show you the ending ahead of time. Right. It's like, what's happening here, So to me, that's a real powerful dynamic, that when teachers get that inquiry piece, it's like, oh, okay, I see. That's a big shift, and aha, and then now I want to do more of that, because it's a real powerful piece there. So let's make sure that we have a way for folks to first of all find it and pre-order the book, and I'll put the link in the show notes. But where should they find both of you and the book and all of those things?
Chris, I'll let you go first.
Okay. All right. The book is through Proof Rock. It's PRUFROCK, Proof Rock Press, and it is project-based learning in the math classroom. And I am in Twitter at CFanch, CFANCH, and I'm. If anybody ever wants to, email a question or whatever, they can use my Buck Institute email address, chris@bie.org. Will be fine.
And I am best to follow on Twitter, because every day during school time I post what's happening in my classroom, and it's TH Norfar, Norfar. I'm also starting to blog about my classroom more at pbl-birdside.blogspot.com. And as Chris said, you can pre-order our book now at Perfect Press.
Okay, great. their names are Telannia Norfar, Chris Fancher. Both of you, I appreciate your giving up your time on a Friday before holidays and Christmas, as I'm sure we're all, I don't know if you all, I know, Chris, you're in school today, and T, I don't know if you were in school, but everything's just sort of compressed and compacted here as we get into Christmas. Somebody said the other day, I saw somewhere on the internet, said, it's December 15th. Why does it feel like there's 45 days left in December or something? So thanks so much. And I think I put this out on Twitter. I can't recommend the book more. I haven't seen the text, but I'm sure, based on the quality of the work that both of you do, that it's worth the read and will be a great resource. So thanks for joining me.
And thank you.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.